This is James Sandy. Today is June 17th, 2024, and I am interviewing Dr. Jim Willbanks. This interview is taking place on Zoom and is sponsored by the UTA Department of History and Geography as part of the Texas Veterans Project. Hey, Jim, thanks for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time to participate.
Good. Glad to talk with you.
So first off, let's start at the beginning, right? Where are you from originally? What can you tell me about growing up?
I was an Army brat, lived all over. Let's see, lived in Huntsville, Alabama, Fort Rucker, Alabama, Leesville, Louisiana, Fort Bliss, Texas, and Fort Hood, Texas. These were all previous names, now known as Cabazos at Fort Hood. Actually graduated from high school, left Copper's Cove where I was in high school in my June. Actually, it was the day that President Kennedy was shot, 22 November 1963. Left, and my family and I went to Charleston. We were at the Air Force Base waiting lounge when Oswald was shot. And then we got on a plane and flew to Europe.
Wow.
And to Augsburg, Germany, and that's where we were for Thanksgiving. In temporary quarters in a place called Cramerdon housing area.
Where were you born, Jim?
I was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas, but my dad was in the military, and we actually lived in Arkansas twice while my dad was in Korea twice. So we lived all over the place.
Gotcha. So our Army family, Army service, military service, it goes back down the family tree at all, or was your dad?
Just my dad. Our tree doesn't have a lot of branches on it. My dad was an orphan, basically. He had a half sister, and no military on my mother's side.
Okay.
So other than an uncle who was in World War II and her brother who was in Vietnam, who just passed away 2 months ago.
Oh wow. What brought your dad to military service, do you think?
It was a job. He was in the Civilian Conservation Corps, had a very poor upbringing, basically joined the CCC, and from CCC went into military during World War II, or prior to the start of World War II. He was pretty young, so he spent most of his time in Hawaii and other places. I didn't really get to the bottom of it. Not a lot. He did fight in Korea and spent 2 tours there during the Korean War.
What was that like growing up as an Army kid? Besides
good,
around?
Good. We moved a lot, so you got to be pretty flexible. Got to see a lot of the country. Like I say, I graduated high school in Germany, which was a unique opportunity for somebody who had never been out of the States before. Got to go to Berlin in 1964 at the height of the Cold War and stand at Checkpoint Charlie. Went into East Germany on one of the sponsored tours, with the only way you could get across the wall. So I had a lot of unique opportunities growing up.
Do you have any siblings?
I have a younger sister, 2 years younger than me, same age as my wife, and a younger brother who's 8 years younger than me.
Okay. So you guys moving around a lot, I'm assuming it's just kind of you guys together as a
Right.
unit. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Were you guys close?
We've become closer. We were close growing up, and then we are spread all over the country, and we've become closer since my parents have passed. My sister lives in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and my brother lives in Franktown, Colorado.
Okay. Okay. So military was obviously a huge part of your early life.
Right.
So you mentioned you were living in Germany when you went to high school?
Yes.
Was that a international school?
No, American school.
What was that like?
Well, it was like a high school anywhere, except it was in Germany. I mean, it's like we had with usual stuff. It was like the high school in Copper's Cove, but bigger, a little bigger, but not massive. At that time, the Army had an entire division inside that part of Germany, split between Augsburg and Munich. It was the 24th Infantry Division then. So there was a sizable number of troops in Europe. In fact, we had troops in France then. even. And so it was a pretty robust American presence. And it was, the American high school in Germany. Great place to grow up. Augsburg was a great city, still is.
Yeah. Were you there your entire high school run?
No, just from, like I say, from second semester of my junior year, my senior year, I graduated there.
Gotcha. And that probably feels kind of expected. You'd moved around quite a bit, but were you kind of concerned moving in the middle of high
Yeah,
school?
we had been in Copper's Cove though for about 6 years, because that was, I graduated in '65, so that was basically before Vietnam had ginned up and after Korea. So the Army was a little more stable at that point before we had started, ginning up for Vietnam. So I guess we had been in that area 7th through the 11th, the first part of my 11th grade. So it was a little traumatic to get up and leave. I played football and ran track and did all that sort of stuff, and I just picked up and left.
Was that that sounds like probably one of the longer places you had been?
Yeah, it was.
Gotcha.
Like I say, the Army was pretty stable then. This was 63 to, actually, I was 59 to 63 that we were there. And lived in a little house, and bought a new house there, which was, a ridiculously low amount of money, nothing fancy, just basically a tract house. It was a good life.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
What was your father doing in the Army at that point before you guys go to Germany?
He was a senior NCO.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
And then
and he had been at that time, he was in an armored unit, but at various times infantry and armor. Um, he ran officers clubs. He did a lot of things.
um,
He actually ran the officers club at Redstone Arsenal and knew Werner von Braun. So
oh wow.
in Huntsville.
That's a name drop.
Yeah, there was that was an interesting time. Then we happened to be at Fort Rucker when they were developing the air assault concept. So I got to see all that training that went on there.
Was that something you were interested in as a kid as you
I
kind of
was always interested in the military. For whatever reason, I was a big reader and growing up, and I like to read heroic stories about heroic people. Kids are, and a lot of it had to do with military, of course. And I wanted to go to West Point or the Air Force Academy. I had a primary appointment to the Air Force Academy and took the test in Wiesbaden, Germany when I was a senior, and all was a go until 30 days before I was supposed to leave, and got a call from the people at Wiesbaden, the hospital, and said, "You have some strange muscle imbalance in one of your eyes, and it's non-waverable. Sorry about that."
wow.
And I'd only applied to A&M primarily because of the Corps Cadets, and Arkansas because I was an Arkansas football fan.
Wow.
I'd only applied to 2 colleges.
What was that like when that you got that news?
Uh, it was um, it was a shock, but an Army kid, you learn to roll with the punches,
Sure.
and it all worked out fine. You know,
Yeah. Wait, so the Air Force Academy though, did
right?
you make that decision over West Point at some point?
No, that's where I had the appointment. I had alternate appointments to West Point, and they didn't pan out.
Hmm.
Actually had an appointment after 2 years at A&M to West Point, but there was no way I was doing that stuff again.
Yeah, for sure. I was
I was halfway through A&M, and I wasn't going to start again at West Point.
for sure. What was that process like securing the appointment? Right? Are they as
You
difficult
had
then?
to approach a congressman, and I approached W.R. Pogue in Waco, who was, I don't know what district it was, but he was a World War II veteran, very, very military friendly, long serving congressman. That's where I got the appointment from.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, so you end up in College Station.
I did. Found a home.
A
I wore my
lifelong.
shirt for you.
I saw, yeah, I did. Yeah, what was that like? What was it like showing up in College Station?
It was fine. I mean, I stayed in trouble most of my first year because I found the place funny. and they don't like freshmen who think things are funny. And it was compounded by the fact that my roommate and I had played football together in Germany. And I didn't realize he was going to A&M because he had moved to Leavenworth, Kansas, of all places, where his dad was in the staff college. And then he came to A&M same time I did, and I met him running up the stairs carrying my foot locker, and we were roommates, and most of the time we spent in trouble.
Wow, small world.
Yep. That was a great place.
Yeah, I want to go back really quick because I don't think I've heard this. Or what was it like playing high school football in Germany? You played a bunch of other American schools?
Yeah. We played. We had like 8 or 9 other teams. Munich, Nuremberg, Würzburg. Actually played Nuremberg in the stadium in Nuremberg. Wow. You've seen the famous picture of the swastika being blown up. I played in that stadium.
Wow, as a senior in high school?
Yep. Without the swastikas, of course.
Hence, they were blown up, right? So
no, we had a robust. It was like I said, American high school with all the things that you would expect: student councils, clubs, football, basketball, wrestling. I wrestled, but I wasn't very good at it because I'd never done it before. You know, so it was a great place.
A little insulated kind of American world over there, it sounds like.
Yeah, but it was in a big city, and so the kids spent a lot of time. I mean, you just get on the Straßenbahn and go downtown, and if you were big enough to give them at that time, it was 4.125 marks to the dollar, so a beer was like nothing.
Yeah,
and they were more than happy to give them to high school kids. So it was a great place to grow up.
Sounds like it. And then you find yourself in the garden spot of the world, College Station, Texas.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I flew from Frankfurt to McGuire, and the airport in Rhein-Main in Frankfurt was full of college kids trying to get back to school. And I remember I flew on a C-121, which is the old Super G Constellation, but it was configured most of them are configured as ECM, as electronic warfare. But that one it was from the West Virginia National Guard with the usual seats facing the backward, and it was full of college kids. It was quite a flight. Took the train down to see my girlfriend in DC, and I flew to, I forget, Dallas, I think, and got on TTA, Treetop Airlines, which became Southwest ultimately.
Oh, wow.
So that was my odyssey from Germany to College Station.
What year was that?
1965.
1965. Did you go through the Corps?
Oh, yeah. The only reason I went.
Gotcha. Okay.
My class was the first one that was not required to take ROTC for the first 2 years. Prior to that, everybody was in the Corps for 2 years, but not my class from that point on.
Gotcha.
We had one female on campus that I was aware of. She was a professor's daughter, and she ultimately graduated with our class. Now I'm not sure. It seems like the females outnumber the males there, which I think is a great thing.
For sure, yeah. What was your major?
History.
History. There we go. Unsurprising.
I majored in the Corps. That's why I was there.
Gotcha. What was the Corps like in 1965 when you got there?
First year, it's a lot of yelling, but I mean, it was kind of. I mean, if you step back from it, it was kind of amusing. It was for kids who had never, were pretty much insulated, country kids, and it was a shock to the system. But Army kids just sort of roll with the punches. It's like being at home, getting yelled at home, no big deal.
Sure. Okay, and you're a history major. Is that something that just kind of, is that an obvious choice for you?
Well, as I said, I was a big reader, and I always liked history. You probably don't remember them because they weren't around more than likely, but there used to be these little orange covered books that were biographies. Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Thomas Jefferson. I grew up on a diet of those things. I just went through them like that in comic books. I know you'll be glad to hear that.
There we go. Yeah.
Sergeant Rock.
We're coming back full circle now too. Good.
Sergeant Rock, Black Hawk,
Yeah.
and GI Joe. Yeah, Sergeant Rock, I guess.
Yeah.
Was
Okay.
my favorite.
Gotcha. So besides the core stuff, which I want to get back to, right? Your course of study in history, right? What was that like? What was the department like? What do you remember about that? Does anybody stand out?
It was good. I remember one professor, Haskell Monroe, who ultimately became the chancellor of the University of Missouri system eventually. But he was extremely good. He taught antebellum South, as I remember. There was one other guy that, I ran into him at the University of Ohio just, 5 or 10 years ago. He was great, but he didn't get tenure there, so he moved out after a year. But those are the two guys I remember the most.
Gotcha.
Um,
And was that something at the time? Do you remember thinking, oh, so I'm going to go to the Army, obviously, but was history something that you thought maybe you would end up doing later in life at any point, or was this just?
I thought maybe I'd like to teach, and ultimately as we went along, PhD became an objective at some point downrange after I got through with the military.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're at A&M. How does it feel progressing through the Corps by the time you're a junior and senior? What's that experience like?
It was fine. I mean, I did reasonably well there. My grades were not tremendous, but they were good. They were good enough to get me into things like the Ross Volunteers, which was a thing that everybody wanted to be in, but was pretty select. I was on staff as a junior and was on staff as a senior until I realized that that by this time it is late '68. Things are pretty grim in Vietnam, and it's pretty clear that those of us with regular commissions, of which I was going to get, are going to Vietnam. So I got married between semesters my senior year. And at that point, I was still in the Corps, but I left my staff job, and I worked all through 4 years, so I was still working. Had a great job my last 2 years. I was a night clerk at one of the mom and pop motels there in town, which no longer exists. But my wife and I lived in the married housing there, Hensel Apartments on campus. It was pretty good. I took 21 hours, made 5 A's and 2 B's. My dad should have said I should have got married as a freshman.
There you go. So I'm assuming you met your wife at A&M?
Nope, met her at home in Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Oh wow.
At
How'd that happen?
youth group at the Methodist Church.
Okay.
And she was a classmate of my sister's. My younger sister, 2 years younger than me, and started dating long distance immediately. Then I went home, and that was, I guess, 1967. So then I spent one summer there working for Army engineers on a dam and reservoir, but doing such beautifully exotic jobs as picking up trash at campsites and all, lovely job like that. Paid well. It was outside, but it was very physical, and I usually needed a bath and sanding down by the time I got home because it was odoriferous, I guess might be the word.
Sure.
And then let's see, before the summer before that, I didn't know it, but I worked in a sawmill, and that sucked. I don't know how to put a finer point on it than that.
Yeah.
I worked from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 11 o'clock at night. And that cemented the idea that I wanted to finish college so I don't have to do that for a living. But anyway, I went to ROTC summer camp, but before my senior year started, and we got married in January of my senior year.
You signed up for the Army life.
And she did, but she didn't know what she was getting into because she was a local girl. I mean, she'd born in Missouri, moved to Hot Spring, never been out of state otherwise, I don't think. But she's a trooper. She adapted, been all over the world. We moved 19 times in 23 years.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so you've mentioned it a bit, but this whole time you're in school, Vietnam is percolating, escalating,
Yes.
getting worse. Is that something that I'm assuming was talked about quite a bit amongst your group of your cohort?
Yeah, pretty much not so much when we were freshmen because that was 65 and 66, but certainly by our sophomore year, 66 and 67, it was pretty clear that we were ended up to our necks. And people we knew began to be wounded, to be killed, go missing. Um, the head yell leader when I was sophomore, I think. Anyway, he went missing as it later was revealed. He was killed in Laos. And several guys from my company that were upperclassmen when I started were killed in Vietnam. And 9 of my classmates were killed in Vietnam.
So this kind of very heavy impending thing hanging over you.
Yeah, it was there. And I came home from ROTC summer. I went to summer camp at Fort Sill between my junior and senior years. And I remember I got home in August. And of course that was after Tet, after Martin Luther King and Kennedy were shot. And then I watched the Democratic National Convention on TV, and I thought the country was coming apart at the seams. That's what it felt like. It felt like the country was just devolving in our very eyes. And that sort of set the tone for my going back to college as a senior.
What was how much of that percolated down to College Station? I mean, today it's a rather isolated place in terms of the.
Well, it wasn't isolated in terms of the war. It was isolated in terms of the anti-war movement. That the SDS folks from Austin came over and they were met at the front gate and basically were told it'd be better if they went back to Austin, which they did, and that was my contact with the anti-war movement. Very conservative place, very supportive of the people that were getting ready to go. But it was always the 900-pound gorilla in the room, no matter what, from about 66 on.
Yeah. What about your dad at this point? Is he retired by this point?
He retired, yes.
Okay.
He had retired. I came back from Germany in 65, and I think they came back in 66 and retired back to Copper's Cove.
Okay.
With my brother and sister.
Okay.
And then ultimately, while I was at A&M, they moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was basically where we were from, but had never lived there. I hadn't.
Gotcha. Okay, so when you're home and this thing's looming and your graduation's coming up, is this something you and your dad ever talk about?
Not much.
No.
No.
Okay.
He was not one to share.
Okay. 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 So, did you ever want to talk to him about it?
Not at that point. I did later in life, but not really then. I was a college kid. I was embroiled with my own little world, which was to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And then I got married, and then I was sure, absolutely sure, I was going to Vietnam. And then I got orders for Germany instead.
Gotcha. Okay, so that means you graduate what, the spring of '69?
May 24, 1969.
Okay, and then how long? What's the gap between I graduate, I'm off to boot camp, wherever you go first?
4 days.
4 days.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was graduate, pack the car, drive to Fort Benning.
Okay. How was that?
Hot. We moved into this lovely place called the Camellia Apartments, which was, well, Fort Benning was a turnstile. People were cycling through there and going to Vietnam. Some, like me, were cycling through there going to Europe. but it was total foment, people moving in, people moving out. This was a set of apartments that were right outside the front gate. One of the people in our courtyard, the lady had to visit by the two guys in a green uniform. And her husband had been an artillery gun chief, and the gun had exploded and killed him
Um,
in
what,
Vietnam.
yeah. What was it like when you found out you weren't going to go to Vietnam immediately?
Well, I was kind of relieved and disappointed, if you can do both at the same time. I was an infantry officer. That's where the war was. And I was still idealistic enough to think that that's where I ought to be. But at that particular point, it was, you got your orders, salute, ruck up and move out, and so off I went to the 3rd Infantry Division.
Did you find that out before you got to Benning, or was that something you found out?
Oh, no, I had orders when we got our orders in a couple months before graduation.
Okay.
And at that time, nobody went directly to Vietnam. The worst you got was 4 months somewhere like Fort Bragg and then Vietnam. So some of us got Europe, some of us got Vietnam, but not a lot of us got Vietnam, because by 1969, of course, Vietnamization had been announced. The first, well, I would guess shortly after we graduated, August, I think, was the first contingent of the 9th Division that came home. So it began to see that maybe there was going to be a disengagement at some point, a long time in the future. It's clear it was a long way off, but so that kind of slowed down the pipeline a little bit, but not a lot. So I ended up in the 3rd Infantry Division in Schweinfurt, Germany.
Back to familiar stomping grounds almost.
It was further north than Augsburg. And it was much better to be a kid in Augsburg than a lieutenant in Schweinfurt, believe me. U.S. Army, and I got there in 1970 after Fort Benning and all that stuff. And the U.S. Army in Europe was fundamentally broken, because by that time, the bills that we had been writing, the checks we had been writing in Vietnam, were being now having to be paid in Europe and the rest of the Army, not in Vietnam. So I would arrive and 38 people were supposed to be in my platoon. I had maybe 18. There were times when I had 4 tracks that I could man the tracks with a driver and a track commander and myself and a platoon sergeant, and that was it. And Schweinfurt is very close to the East German border. We would go out and sit up in our alert position and put out metal stakes that said grenadier, machine gunner, and rifleman to take the place of the guys we didn't actually have on the ground.
Wow. What was your job there fully?
I was platoon leader first.
Okay.
And I was the battalion motor officer for a while, and then I was a company executive officer for a while.
Okay.
And then I volunteered to go to Vietnam to get out of there.
Okay. Before we do that, I want to go back really quick. So you said you get to Benning. What was basic training like at Benning? What was your training experience like?
I was a summer at Fort Benning. It was not pleasant. It was hot. I have a grandson who's down there right now in basic training. And he told me, Pop, it's not going to be hot as it is here. And I said, hey, it's going to be just as hot as it is here. And here's how you can prepare yourself. Soak yourself, go outside, and roll around in sawdust for 9 weeks, and that's basic training. He's been there a week. I think he's found that out already.
Have you spoken to him since he's gotten it?
No, he's only called home once. He's going to be in the Nebraska National Guard while he goes to the University of Nebraska. Not my recommendation.
Well, no bias.
That's where his dad went.
Okay. We can forgive him.
I'll have to think about it.
Okay, so Benning, hot, sawdust, summer at Benning. Did you feel prepared?
Well, I didn't go in empty, because we had done. If you do nothing else at A&M, you do leadership training. I mean, everything is focused on that. Whatever you're either a squad leader, you're a team leader, you're a platoon leader, you're a company commander, you're a battalion commander. So it's all focused on that. So it wasn't like I was going in totally cold. Get a lot on patrolling, a lot on tactics, a lot on maintenance, a lot on weapons. So I felt, I felt reasonably prepared as a platoon leader when I got to Germany.
Gotcha. Did you go somewhere after Benning or something
No,
like AIT? No, it was just Benning straight to your post. Huh?
yeah,
Okay.
came home on
Um,
leave at Christmas, and then I went over first. I got unaccompanied travel, which means my wife didn't come with me. So I had to go get set up, and then she flew over, and I had to go pick her up. First time she'd ever been out of the country, so talked to her.
oh, well, how was that? Did she enjoy living in Germany?
She got used to it. She was very family oriented. She came from a family of four girls, and very close family. It was very difficult on, particularly when I went to Vietnam. She went home, but I had a unusual tour, probably the best.
Yeah. Okay. So how long are you in Germany?
17 months.
17 months. Okay. And is the situation you described about the broken army, is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
No, it was worse.
Getting
Oh,
continued.
now you mean, or then?
Then over the course
Oh
of the
no,
time you were there.
it was totally broken. Race problems, drug problems, buildings falling apart. We had no money. At one point, we put half our vehicles. This is an mechanized infantry battalion. We put half our vehicles in admin storage because we couldn't man them, we couldn't fuel them, and we couldn't fix them.
Wow.
So, infantry battalion that is basically the Soviets could put artillery rounds in our motor pool without moving, and I have half a company, half a battalion basically,
Yeah. Is
command
that
our part of the inter-German border.
is that something that your cohort, the group of people you're around are actively trying to fix, or is that something that is kind of accepted by that point?
Oh, it was systemic. I mean, you can't do anything about not having any troops. And then the Army did some things that weren't particularly bright. I didn't think I would get shake and bake sergeants who would come in with less than 6 months to go into service, rather than and they would send them from Vietnam to Germany with less than 6 months to go. And most of them were good Americans and tried to do a decent job, but let's face it, they weren't highly motivated other than to get out of the Army at that point. The Army was not a good place in 1970, 71, 72.
That's not terribly helpful.
We had tremendous race problems. We had all kinds of all the indiscipline that you saw in Vietnam that you're aware of. That's just a reflection of the society from which that army is drawn, and it's the same army that's in Vietnam,
Yeah.
with access to all kinds of drugs. I had at one point I had like 12, 13 people in Mannheim in the lockup. This is the serious lockup. This is not just local confinement. This is jail.
For drug related.
Drug, armed robbery, attempted murder,
Wow.
you name it.
Wow.
At one
What
point, we had duty officers in every company, the 5 companies and the tie-in, every night with locked and loaded 45s against our own troops.
wow. What kind of what is that like? You've been heading towards joining the army your entire life, it seems. What is that first experience in Germany like, that is the army you encounter?
Well, I volunteered to go to Vietnam, if that answers your question.
How soon was that
Um,
that you volunteered?
I started about a year after I got there. It took me about 4 trips to Heidelberg before the paperwork was accepted. And by this point, this is mid 71. By the time I get there, December 71, there are 4 infantry battalions left out of 76, I think was the highest number.
Yeah.
So I got to Vietnam, but it was clear I wasn't going to be in a U.S. unit unless I was very lucky. So I ended up going to train as an advisor before I went.
Hmm. What was that like? The culture training, language training? Where was
I
that?
went to Fort, and I'm using the old names here because
Yeah,
that's
that's fine.
I'm unreconstructed, I guess. Fort Bragg, and it was called the Military Assistant Advisors Course, NATA course, and it was it seems like 11 weeks if I remember right. It was primarily how to be an advisor. There was some stuff on culture. There was some concurrent language training. It was better than nothing, other than, just send me over and say, hey, you're an advisor. So, I knew something about the organization of the South Vietnamese Armed Forces, uh, rudimentary language training, some familiarization on things Vietnamese. I remember they had a Vietnamese village that was full of booby traps and all that, stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and then I went to El Paso because only the Army would send you to El Paso to learn Vietnamese. I went to language school at Biggs Field at Fort Bliss for another 11 weeks.
Oh wow. Okay.
So I was quite fluent in El Paso, less so when I got to Vietnam.
Yeah, can imagine. So Bragg, El Paso, and then off to
Off to
Saigon.
Vietnam. Got there on 4 December 1971.
What was that experience like?
Well, initially it was eye opening. The ubiquitous sergeant with the clipboard at Camp Alpha, where you process sound, said, "Why are you here, Captain? This war is over. You won't even get a CIB, Combat Infantryman's Badge." And so I hung around there for a couple of days till they found me a job. And they said, "Okay, since you trained to be an advisor with the ARVN, we're going to send you to the Royal Thai Army in Vietnam." If I didn't speak much Vietnamese, I spoke zip all Thai. So I went to this outfit called the Special Liaison Section, which was at Bearcat, which is pretty close to Benoit. And they essentially had at the height of their commitment, had about 11,000 troops there. Queen's Cobra, Black Panther, pretty good troops, but they were in a process. As we were drawing down, so were the Free Will Military Forces, of which the RTA, Royal Thai Army in Vietnam, was part of. So they were drawing down, and all we did was help them leave. Um, and so I was there for about a month and a half, and I was told, you don't have a job here anymore because there's the Special Liaison Section stood down. Go find a job." So I took a Jeep and went around to the three ARVN divisions and in Military Region 3, and ultimately ended up at the 18th ARVN in Twinlop, which was down toward the coast from Benoit. And there I was signed to one of the regimental combat teams, which meant that we went out with the ARVN battalions, and our normal day would be myself and one other guy would go out with a battalion, and we would either fly in or walk in, and then go around the jungle looking for the bad guys for 5 to 10 days, and then come back in, clean up, and go out with the next battalion. Because at that point, all the advisor teams had been withdrawn, drawn down as well. And whereas they used to have advisors, all the battalions ended up with just a few advisors at the regimental level. So we were doubling, tripling up with the battalions. So I did that for the first 2 months. My tour was really 4 parts. One of the ties, once was prior to the Easter offensive, once was the Easter offensive, and the other part was the Easter offensive after I was wounded. So I went with the ties. Then I went out. We did this for a month and a half or so. During that period, I was wounded for the first time in a large ambush. Later, my research has revealed that we ran into a regiment that was repositioning for what was coming, which was the Easter offensive. I took part of an RPG in the leg, was evacuated to a hospital, 93rd Evac in Long Bend, spent a week, 10 days there, got out, was on crutches. I wasn't hurt bad enough to be sent back to the States, but I was on crutches. So they made me the headquarters commandant. and for the advisory team. With these advisory teams, at the height of it was probably 125 to 150 people, but it was steadily being drawn down. And at the same time, the footprint on the landscape was being drawn down as well. So we were turning back land to the Arvin division. So that's primarily what I did. And then on a couple of days before Black Friday, the North Vietnamese attack. And in the process, we had a 2-battalion task force up between An Loc and Loc Ninh on the Cambodian border. They were overrun. One of the captain was wounded pretty badly. They extracted him under fire. And the advisory team said, well, the remnants of the 2 battalions are now in An Loc. We need somebody to go up there with them. So the Cav squadron advisor and myself volunteered to go. So we drove to Lac, got on a helicopter and flew to An Loc on the 12th of April, and the 13th of April, the tanks attacked. And I was there for most of the next 3 months. I came out for about 2 weeks and went back in the middle of it. And that was the preponderance of my tour, was during the Easter offensive at An Loc.
When you're serving as an advisor, what is your kind of your role, and how would you describe your role? Are you helping at what level are you kind of at?
I would accompany the battalion commander, but I was a captain. I've been in the Army barely 3 years. The guy I was supposed to advise had been fighting his whole adult life. There wasn't anything I could tell him about fighting. I did have a radio. I could call in airstrikes and artillery and dust-offs, and I could provide information to my higher headquarters, who was liaisoning with them at division level, and that's primarily what I did. The idea that I was if you want to think about true advising, that would be somebody like Ron Milam down with a district team, with some militia guys who really don't know what they're doing. These guys knew what they were doing. There wasn't anything I could tell Major 10, my first counterpart. I mean, he knew more about fighting than I would ever know. But he couldn't access TAC Air or B-52s or any of those, and I could.
How would you describe your relationship with your counterpart, like the major you just announced? How was that working relationship then?
It was proper. The problem was when people talk about, Ron Milam belongs to an organization that I titularly, I belong to, but don't really participate, called Counterparts. I didn't have any counterparts because I was a small group at a regiment headquarters that worked with all 3 battalions. I didn't get a chance to know anybody very well. I'd show up and they would go, "There's the American with the radio, come on." And the idea that I would, build some close relationship with somebody I knew about his family, didn't happen. But there were so few of us that we were just constantly in foment there, in with one unit, back out with another unit. So I didn't get to know any of them very well.
What was that experience like for you? Is that something? Because that's probably not what you expected of your time in Vietnam.
Well, I think it was expected then because it was pretty lonely out there. There weren't a lot of Americans. There were 4 infantry battalions left in country, 2 in Military Region 3. They were primarily guarding Bien Hoa Air Base, and 2 up north, and they were guarding Da Nang and a couple other places. The only people who were in the field actively searching for the enemy were the advisors. And there were so few of us, I think it was maybe 5,400 total in the entire country from north to south. So by the time I left, our division advisory team was down to less than 20 people, from a high of probably 125 maybe.
Yeah, you sounded like you were busy, from one thing to the next, always moving.
Well, the first, until I was wounded, I basically was come in, take a break for a day or two, and then while somebody else went out with another battalion, And then the other battalion would get ready to go out with them. And that was just one after the other.
Yeah.
Very little downtime. Actually lived out with the regiment. That regiment lived on a base called Black Horse, which had been the home of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment when they were there, but they had gone and turned it over to the South Vietnamese. The regiment did have it was a large base. We didn't have enough people to man the berm all the way around, which meant that one side of it was open.
Are you so you're married, right, this whole time, right? How
Right.
much contact are you getting to communicate back home?
Zero letters.
Zero. Letters.
I call home twice. I take it back. I won't call home three. Then I thing called Mars, which basically is through a radio link to somebody who has a ham and then puts the phone up there, and you had to go. I call my mom, and you have to go, Mom, over. And Mom never figured it out, and it was so frustrating that I just never did it again. That was called Mars, but I did call home on a regular phone twice, both in the hospitals.
Mm.
One from the 93rd evac, and then later one from third field in Saigon. After my second time being wounded, my son was in Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd do Zoom calls, whenever he could get a computer link, which depending on what base he was on, was every night.
Yeah.
That has pluses, but it also has minuses. And if you're in a combat zone, you really don't want to hear that the washer's not working. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And so it makes your family pretty self-sufficient while you're gone. I think that's a different dynamic now, and I'm not sure that's a good thing, frankly. But it's like, it is what it is.
Did you guys didn't have children by this point yet?
We did. We had
Oh, you
one.
did? Had one. Okay. When was your first child born?
1970.
1970. Okay. So as you were in Germany, on the way to Germany?
She was born in Germany, in Würzburg.
Okay.
She's no longer with us.
I'm really sorry to hear that.
She passed away in a car accident at Fort Bragg in 2008.
Really sorry.
And that's why we raised our granddaughters.
So back to South Vietnam, do you remember being stressed? How did you deal with the stress? What is your kind of emotional state in this whirlwind tour?
Usually we're so busy, we didn't have much time to worry about it. I mean, focus was on getting through the next 24 hours in one piece. That has a way of causing you to focus laser-like, not worry about anything else.
Yeah.
So before Analog started, or before the East Offensive started, we would just go out and we would, tromp through the jungle looking for the enemy. And it was usually very difficult because it was hot. The terrain was tough. This was in triple canopy jungle, and it was always moving, always wet. But my job was to trail along behind the battalion commander. Half the time I didn't know what he was doing because I didn't understand him. They spoke French in many cases, but I don't. So, it was sometimes you kind of felt like you were out there, among 400 or 500 people by yourself. I mean, it was a very odd feeling.
Yeah. And were you the only American a lot of the time?
We did not like to send Americans out by themselves. We'd usually be me and another American, another officer or enlisted guy. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I was wounded, the guy with me was a spec bore who, was the signal guy. He just wanted to go to the field. I think he got that out of his system real quick.
One and done, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he's a good kid. We just happened in that case to stumble into, it was a meeting engagement between our battalion and that regiment. And I am almost sure that that's what they were doing, was they were repositioning for the Eastern Offensive. And we just happened to run into them.
Hmm.
And we just happened to stumble into it. And we just happened to stumble into it. And we just happened to run 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 into it. And we just
So you mentioned a couple times, but Anlock, this is kind of the standout moment of your tour, correct?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to ask what that was like because I think I understand, but what's the
It
takeaway?
was pretty strange because it was a level of combat that even the senior officers on our division had never ever seen. And at the point, if they're driving tanks, they ain't guerrillas. And we arrived on the 11th of April. As we're flying into town, they've hit Lockton already. They have moved south past where our task force was overrun, pushed off. They weren't overruns. The survivors made it into Anlock. So it was clear that they were coming. And I vaguely knew that things were unfolding also at Khartoum and at Quang Tri, and that it was big. As we're flying up, the pilots came on, and we had on headsets, and they said, the enemy is shelling the city. We're not going to land. There's a hole dug in the soccer field. We're going to fly in there, hover over that hole for about 2 seconds. When we tell you jump, jump. They flew in, slowed the helicopter down, said jump. We unasked it to the right and left, ended up in the hole, and the artillery started landing. And once it stopped, every time anything flew in, they started shooting. And so they'd stopped, and because the helicopter flew away, then we made our way and found the unit. And it was set up in a bank in the north end of town. And we introduced ourselves. Neither one of us knew the major, who was the battalion commander. And so we just tried to get ourselves situated. And I went up on the next morning. I was up on top of the building, put on the 2902, which is a very long antenna that has guy wires, so it gives you a really extended range for FM radios, so we could talk to people back in the rear. And I heard a commotion and heard people screaming "Tit Gap." I didn't know what the hell that was. So I ran downstairs, and I was on top of the building, and ran around the corner, and here come a bunch of T-54s right into the city. And at that point, the major grabbed me and says, we go. We jumped in a Jeep and hauled ass south, right in front of the tank. And ultimately set up down in the south. The units that were on our left and right up there they were established. Our guys were just sitting around. They had just gotten in the night before. They slowed the tanks down, and ultimately we ended up circling the wagons and had about half of the town in a perimeter, and then surrounded on all sides by the North Vietnamese. And that's the way it was for the next almost 3 months. We did get reinforced after the first, I don't know, 5 or 6 days. The Airborne Brigade was put in south of town to open the road, which it never was opened, but they pulled them out and flew them up and put them in to a place called Windy Hill, east of town. There were 3 battalions. One of the battalions landed on top of the North Vietnamese regiment and was just about wiped out. The other 2 battalions made it into and set up in the perimeter. And that's what went on for the rest of the next April and into May. Mostly it was sit in bunkers and call airstrikes while they fired, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 rounds a day into the city. I ended up with the province team, which was set up in an old set of 18 bunkers, special forces bunkers down in the southern part of the city that had 12-inch concrete slabs on top of the bunker. And so we took several direct hits, but luckily the bunkers were built very well. The buildings around us, the province headquarters, all the stuff above ground, it was just flat.
How does how does that situation end for you? Like, how do you eventually end up leaving that experience?
Well, we were the only guys up there from our division. So the division decided that in a lull that we had been there a month, they were going to pull us out, me and well, actually by that point, it was just me. uh, because the major I went up with, he was a tanker and he was about half nuts anyway. He went out to get him a tanker helmet off of one of the killed T-54s and was jumping off the front slope and a rocket hit right in front of the tank and splattered him. So he was in pretty bad shape and we couldn't get any helicopters in. So after 2 days, I carried him south of town and they got a helicopter came in and picked him up. So for the rest of that time, I was by myself. So they decided to take me, one other guy from the province team, and Colonel Miller, who was the senior advisor to the Fifth Army, to replace us with fresh guys. Miller was going to be a brigade commander at Fort Campbell, and they pulled the other captain and me out just to kind of give us a rest. I ultimately ended up going back up there at a rest. And things by the time I got back up there it was mid-May, and things had kind of settled down a little bit. There were still probing attacks, but the last big attack was on 10 May, and it was 5 regiments. And had it not been for the B-52s, they would have taken the city. Jonah Hollingsworth, one of my personal heroes, who I wrote a book about, also an A&M graduate, I might add. One of our jobs was to report to him what was going on the battlefield. And over a time, there was a pattern that started. It was sort of an attack. They would be almost successful, but the attack air and the B-52s would surge and they would fall back and kind of go into a lull and get ready for the next attack. Well, they figured after the second attack what was coming, and he projected out. And his intel guy said that the next big push was going to come about 10 May. So he went to Abrams and said, I need every B-52 you've got. And Abrams said, okay, because we were 65 miles from Saigon. So there was. So he planned a B-52 strike every 55 minutes, starting at 0500, I think it was 10 May, for the next 24 hours. And that's what broke the attack, because at that point they attacked with 5 regiments and we had less than 3,500. Most of them wounded. And that was really the high point for the North Vietnamese. They almost were successful, but the attack air was, the B-52s just laid waste to them.
Yeah. So
there was artillery still coming in. There were still small attacks, but no multi-regimental attacks. And was, compared to the earlier part of the battle in April and early May, it was manageable. And then on 9 July, General Tallman, who was Hollingsworth's deputy, in his G3 plans, and his aide and a Vietnamese master sergeant interpreter flew into the city, and we went out to meet them as artillery had been falling. In fact, we'd taken a round in the command bunker that morning. And for some reason, they came in. They shouldn't have come in. But they landed, jumped off the helicopter. One round came in, went over the pad. And there were spider holes everywhere. Because this was like World War I. It wasn't anything like maneuver. We was World War I. There were bunkers, holes. So we jumped in these spider holes. And, we didn't hear another round come out. We all got up and headed running for the main bunker. And the second round landed in the middle of us. And it killed 4 instantly, counting the sergeant. Wounded myself and the major that I'd gone out with, and mortally wounded the general. And they dusted him and me and the major off to Saigon, and he died on the operating table. And that was it for me. I didn't go back. I spent a month in the hospital.
Was that the end of your time in Vietnam, essentially?
Nope. No, I stayed. At that particular point, we weren't sure what the hell was going on, but I decided that, I'm ambulatory. They're not sending me home. I only got like 3 months left on my tour. I'm staying.
Oh.
I'm going to get full credit for a tour. So I had one of the things, I'd had a blast injury. I'd lost all the hearing in my right ear because it ruptured the eardrum. So I couldn't hear, which is detrimental to your long-term health, that kind of a situation. So they sent me to be the G3 training advisor for the last month and a half I was there. And they moved the training center down to Longhai on the coast. So the last month and a half, I lived down on the South China Sea, uh, training guys for replacements, which was interesting because we would run patrols up in the long training patrols in the Longhai Mountain, and that must have been, in retrospect, it probably was a communist R&R area because we always had contact on the training patrols, which has a motivating factor for the trainees.
For sure, yeah.
But it was, I mean, we were right on the beach up against the Longhai Mountains, north of Bungtao,
Hmm.
Cape St. Jacques. So those were my four pieces. It was a very fun-packed year.
Sounds like it. I mean, for being there so late in the war, I mean, the amount of combat you actually saw and kind of the intensity of it seems almost counterintuitive to what kind of we generally think about the Vietnam
Yeah,
War.
and I taught a course at KU, University of Kansas, on Vietnam for as an adjunct for I don't know 10 years at night. I also taught an elective at CGSC. Um, and when I get to that particular point and sort of talk about my experiences, not about me, but about that part of the war, they're like, "What? We thought the war was over in 1968." And that was one of the things that motivated my study, because if you read people the classics like Krapenovich, the Army in Vietnam, the war was over in '68. It decidedly was not over in '68. So that sort of motivated me to look at the latter part of the year, kind of, without getting melodramatic, try to figure out what my personal experience, how it fit in the larger context. And
Sure.
that's what I've done for my post army life,
Yeah. Okay,
post
so
uniform life, I guess.
okay, so that's a great segue, right? So you have this kind of final section of your tour. You finish up your 12 months ish, and then you come home. And what's that experience like?
Uh, was a shock. I went from Vietnam to streets of San Francisco in 20 hours. It's kind of a shock to the system. I wasn't spit upon when I got home. It was total ambivalence. Where are you? I've been in Vietnam. Well, I thought we've been gone Vietnam. What are you doing in Vietnam? And so someone who just had the experience that I had, it was sort of a cold shower, if it makes any sense.
Yeah.
Because most people said, well, that war was over. What the hell were you doing there? And I still get that from people.
Yeah.
At the majors, they look at me like a stunned mullet when I tell them what happened in 1972 because they have no idea.
Yeah. How
For
do
many
you?
years, there was nothing in the historiography about that part of the war until Sorley's book came along, which I have a lot of problems with. But it was the first book that talked about, anything after the preponderance of the U.S. forces were gone,
Yeah.
U.S. units.
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult that must be to not only deal with kind of on your own level, but then with this kind of external complete
Oh yeah,
misunderstanding.
I still see it. I don't hang around with the veteran crowd, but I'm sometimes foisted in the middle of it. And the question is, when were you there? Well, 1972. Well, the war was over. What did you do? I was an advisor. Oh, well, you didn't do anything. You missed the war. Well, really? I have two Purple Hearts that says I didn't miss much.
Yeah.
So that's personal baggage I have to deal with.
Well, but it's an essential part of your experience, though, and it's
Yeah.
it's why your story is important.
Mm.
So dropped off in San Francisco, go off about. I mean, how did you stay in the army after that? What's
I
what's
did.
your
I
what's your
did. I
pathway
flew
then?
home to Hot Springs. I would tell you that my tour was maybe harder on my family than it was on me. Um, because of a litany of errors, I was reported missing for a while. I wasn't. I was out of contact. I was not missing. They knew exactly where I was. But somehow my family didn't get any letters from me for like a month, and I was pretty regular. So I don't know who it was. My mother, my dad, somebody went to the Red Cross. They did their, whatever the Red Cross does, and came back and said he's missing. And in fact, I was not. I just was out of contact. I was still in contact by radio. What they meant was I couldn't get mail in or out. That got bastardized somewhere.
It seems like
So
a
it was
poor
very hard on
definition.
my parents, and it was extremely hard on my wife. And I don't want to go into any great details, but it almost was fatal for our marriage. We got over it eventually, but that was true of a lot of families, I think.
Yeah. Well, especially as the war is quote unquote over for everybody else, right? And that an increasingly small amount of people are dealing with the consequences of it.
Yep.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Okay, so you get home, and what's next for your Army career?
Off to Fort Ord to be a basic training company commander, Fort Ord, California, Monterey, and that's where I am. I got home in December of '72. I reported there January '73, and was there through May of '75. So that's where I watched the fall of Saigon on TV.
Hmm. What was that like for you?
Painful. I think the moment that it all came home to me was when they were pushing those Hueys over the side of those ships. Because all I could think of is what a waste.
Yeah.
What a complete waste. Because the helicopter was everything to people who would be. I still hear one today, and I will look. I can hear it. I can't hear my wife talking in the other room, but I can hear a Huey 5 miles away.
Yeah.
And all I could think of was, how can they do that? How can they push those helicopters off the side of that ship? I mean, that's what I'm thinking about while the Saigon is falling. As ridiculous as that might seem,
Doesn't seem ridiculous at all. It's
and it stuck with me because I thought, God, I just can't believe this.
yeah.
I cannot believe it. Because when I left, I thought the Vietnamese had a reasonable chance of standing. They, the people, a lot of veterans who were with U.S. units were never around ARVN. They disparaged the ARVN. But when it came down to it, when they had to fight, they did. And at the end of the day, after an unbelievable carnage at An Loc, it's almost impossible to describe what it was like. At the end of the day, they held the city, and the North Vietnamese didn't. And that was the proof of the pudding there, to mix, 4 or 5 metaphors.
Yeah.
So I thought, given the support that we gave them, and we gave them a lot of support. And I will tell you that in An Loc, my primary function was not as an advisor. It was largely to be able to access U.S. support. But maybe more than that was I wore a U.S. Army name tag, and as long as I was standing next to that South Vietnamese officer, he knew that America was not going to abandon him, because they weren't going to abandon me. They had made the choice in Quang Tri to pull the advisors out, and you know what happened in Quang Tri. The whole place folded in a matter of days, and ultimately Quang Tri itself fell. And we were told, that's not happening here. You guys are in until this thing is over one way or the other. And I think that in the end made the difference. So I thought, if that support, which we both know that Nixon promised, if it was there, they've got a reasonable chance of surviving. But as it turned out, it wasn't there, and we both know what happened.
What is it like to be in the Army, post your Vietnam experience, as 73 and 74 are coming along, and it's becoming clearer that that American support isn't going to hang around?
It's almost a non-event.
Hmm.
It is almost. We are out of there in '73. We're focused on the Fulda Gap and stopping the Red Hordes in Europe. That's our entire focus. And the fact that you went to Vietnam, everybody went to Vietnam, no big deal. But at the same time, Well, I remember an incident. They used to have, it's all digital now, but they used to have these brown manila folders, dark brown. That was your field file, and all your OER, officer efficiency reports, would be in there. And it was your life in paper. And so they would send these teams out with boxes full of these files, and you would go in for a file evaluation and tell you how you were doing. So I did that. I was company commander at Fort Ord. After duty hours, I met this major. Interestingly enough, I ended up working for him later in my career. And he sits down, and they have the old, the two-prong hole punch.
Mhm.
And he's got my file there, and he turns over and he goes through my OERs, and he starts talking, and he gets to the 4 I got in Vietnam, because I had basically 4 different bosses at various times. I said, "Excuse me." He doesn't say anything. He just turned him over, keeps talking about my first OER at Fort Ord. And I said, "Major, what about those in Vietnam?" And he said, "Well, everybody went to Vietnam. They don't really count. And you were an advisor. It'd been better if you just stayed in Germany and been a rifle company commander, because advisory duty is not really good duty for your career." And I'm going, "Well, F me. How am I supposed to handle that?"
Wow.
And that was sort of, at that point, I grew this giant chip on my shoulder, I'm pretty sure. Uh, and it was just sort of like that whole year didn't count. And of course, you're getting my perspective on this for whatever it's worth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, I can't imagine how frustrating that must have been.
It was extremely frustrating.
But then the point that you have to almost put it to the side to move on within your career or within however else you want to put it, that has to be incredibly difficult.
It was like a non-event. Sure it was. Is what it is. I'm gonna have that put on my tombstone after I told you I didn't feel
Yeah. Okay, so how long are you in the Army post Vietnam? What's the trajectory of the
from
rest of your career?
1973 to 1992. So let's see. I went to Fort Ord, California. I went to Fort Benning, Georgia. I went to Fort Hood. Went to Japan. Went to Fort Lewis, Washington. Went to Leavenworth on the faculty. Went to Panama. Went back to Leavenworth and retired. And stayed on. And then took on my uniform and stayed on the faculty,
Yeah.
teaching as a joint officer, teaching national security strategy.
So
While I started my PhD at KU at night, which
okay,
only took me 8 years, by the way.
at night, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Plus, in the middle of it, I had a trip to Panama and a trip to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. What was the Army like? Obviously, we have this kind of like immediate post Vietnam moment, but what's it like growing with the Army as it attempts to forget, move on, transition?
Immediately after Vietnam, it was still fundamentally broken. I mean, we're still paying checks for Vietnam in many ways. Uh, the Army is not a good place to be, from the American public's view, which means it has a tremendous impact on recruiting, on funding, on just about every aspect of military life. And it's pretty grim until the Reagan administration. It starts getting better under Carter, interestingly enough. There start to be pay raises. It starts to kind of make a transition. You see the old Army ad went from the Army wants to join you when we're trying to get anybody we can in to be all you can be.
Yeah.
And it begins to sort of start an upward trajectory in terms of the view of the military in the eye of the American public, which means that recruiting is going to get better. Under Reagan, the funding gets better. We get new equipment. The Big Five developed those weapon systems that will be so important during Desert Storm 15 years later. But it's a pretty hard slog there. There are a lot of people are getting out, went through rifts, like about 4 or 5 reduction in forces of officers, to include rifting West Point officers, which had never been done before. To give you an example, I was in a basic training battalion, which is primarily company commanders and drill sergeant and a battalion staff. So in this one battalion, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Brigade, Fort Ord, there were 7 captains, 5 company commanders, 2 captains on staff with a lieutenant colonel and a major. I went to work one day and there was me and one other captain left. The rest of them had received rift notices, which means they had 60 to 90 days to get out of the service. And this happened 4 or 5 times. One of my company commanders in Europe was rifted. He was prior service. So he went from being a captain aviator to an E6, back to an E6 sergeant. Those who had come in from OCS or something like, they didn't have that choice. And there were some fine officers that were our headquarters brigade commander, headquarters brigade company commander, headquarters company. He had 3 tours in Vietnam, a DSC, 4 Silver Stars, had been special forces, did not have a college degree, and was invited to leave. One of the finest soldiers I've ever known. And he was just summarily let go. Many aviators that we had brought in, sent to flight school, many of them did not have college degrees. They were in the first cohort that was sent. So it was pretty grim there for about 5 years. And then it began to slowly turn. So there were those who said to hell with it and got out and went in business or law school. And then there was the people who said, well, we got to stay and try to fix this thing.
Yeah. Did you ever think about maybe this isn't something I'm going to stick around?
I had 2 thoughts. One of them was very selfish. I was on the surgical ward in 3rd Field for a month. And I saw this captain running around and he's got on khakis. We're in Vietnam. And I said, who is that guy? And they said, well, he's a medical service guy. He's a hospital administrator. And I said, shit, I should change branches. That was a fleeting thought. But I did, when I was at Ord, the Army came out with this fully funded law school program. And they would send you to law school, pay you like you were, whatever your rank was, mostly captain. And then you would be a JAG. And so I applied for it. I went and took the LSAT at UC Santa Cruz, did well on it, got accepted at, I don't know, I forget, Oklahoma, Tulane, somewhere else, I don't know. And then the Army comes back and says, you're not eligible. And I said, why not? And they said, well, you've got 3 months too much commission service. And it's not waiverable. It's statutory, not waiverable. So you can't even apply. And I said, you got to be kidding me. And they said, nope. So I stayed an infantry officer. That's the only time I flirted with being something other than an infantry officer.
Was there any point?
I don't like lawyers anyway, so it turned out.
Was there any point in that kind of that post moment where you were thinking about just leaving the service completely?
No, not really. I didn't. I don't know. It just I always wanted to be in the military. I didn't know anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, other than that flirting with the law school thing, nothing really occurred to me. You just soldier on. Yeah. And along the way, I worked for some good people who kept me in the game. Yeah.
Okay, so as you're in this kind of this back half of your career, right, is that the Army's changing, and eventually you end up at Leavenworth. You said the Command and General Staff College. You become involved in professional military education. What is there a moment where you're like, oh, this is something that I'm good at, I can do? How did that happen?
No, after I left Japan, I went to CGSC. And then they started the SAMS program, the second year of CGSC. It was a new program. And I was in the first cohort of that, me and 13 other folks. And it was very history intensive. Everything basically was history, basis, doctrine, tactic. It was on that 3-part model, everything we looked at. So history was very important. And it was with General Huba or Colonel Huba Vastasega then, who was one of the bright shining minds in the Army. And it was the best year that I spent intellectually in the Army. So I go out to Fort Lewis then and spend 3 years there in what they call a utilization tour for that extra time. I stayed at Leavenworth for 2 years. Then I go back to Leavenworth because the commanding general took some of us that had been there back to Leavenworth because he was going to be the commander. And I taught tactics for a while. And then right before Just Cause, I was reassigned to Panama to work for Max Thurman. And I spent 2 years down there without my family, which I really didn't need to practice. I'd done that before. But, I got there right after Just Cause was over, and it was like Boots on Territory, 1876. I mean, it was wild. There were no cops. Traffic lights didn't work. We wore privately owned weapons under our BDUs. You know, my apartment was broken into at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Wednesday. I mean, it was nuts. Like Panama a lot, but it was crazy then. So about that time, I decided, the Army was still downsizing in some sense. It was pretty clear I probably wasn't going to get promoted to colonel. And I was frankly just getting tired of moving around. And so I went back to Leavenworth and spent a year and then retired. And prior to going to Panama, I'd started my PhD program at KU. And so my plan was to get my PhD and then return to A&M on the faculty, which never really panned out. So I worked on my PhD, took a job teaching national security strategy in the Joint Combined Arms Department, wearing a coat and tie. Worked on my PhD at night. And then in the midst of that effort, our daughter passed away and our granddaughter come to live with us. And so she was with us for 15 years and we stayed in Leavenworth. So aside from flirting with trying some other jobs after I got my PhD, we just stayed there. Never intended to spend that long in Kansas, believe me. But it worked out fine. I had a great job. Loved the students, loved my job, loved the people I worked with. Hated the weather, loved the Chiefs. In my jersey back there.
Yeah, I saw.
And that's how I ended up staying there 26 years. I did leave for 2 years. I took a leave of absence from the faculty. Thankfully, they let me take a leave of absence. And I went to Saudi Arabia and infantry doctrine for the Royal Saudi Land Forces Infantry Corps and lived in Riyadh for 2 years, once again, unaccompanied. But
when was that?
96 to 98.
Wow.
And when I think about this, it causes me to pause. I took all of my notes and all of my sources and put them into 2 footlockers and shipped them to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So I bought a new computer, and what I did for the 2 years I was there was write my dissertation on Vietnam in Saudi Arabia. And I had great Combined Arms Research Library was fantastic. They were shipping me books to Saudi Arabia while I was on leave of absence. So and they were helping me with my research. I had most of my primary source stuff already done. It was just a matter of working full time was very difficult to sit down and write anything.
Yeah.
So I had basically almost 2 years to write it, which I did.
So were you essentially a civilian employee of the Army, DOD?
I was a contractor. I worked for TRW Space out of LA, who had the contract for, they called it integration, but it was training. The Saudis had bought a Bradley Brigade and an Abrams Brigade, lock, stock, and barrel, including the training and the doctrine parts with it. So what I did is I wrote the doctrine for them. And I lived in what looked like a high-end condo in Arizona, except that it was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
For 2 years.
Some of the best living I've ever done, except it was in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. And then you came back to
The day I finished it, I went to the program manager and said, I'm a dot. I'm out of here. And he said, please stay 2 more months to finish the project that we're working on, and I'll give you a bonus. And I said, okay. I stayed 2 months, and then I went back to Leavenworth, went back into the same desk I had left, and went about my business. Got my PhD under Ted Wilson at KU in May of '98.
And then began cementing the institution that is Jim Willbanks at CGS.
Well, it's that, you know, man plans, God laughs, and that was sure the case there. Yeah. I just stayed there. There are other things I would have liked to. I'd like to have done the Johnson chair if it had been, if I'd been qualified at Carlisle. Things I don't even know if I was qualified for, but I didn't try because we had our granddaughter. And she had enough trauma in her life, and we weren't going to give her any more by moving. So,
yeah, by that point, I wonder if you've moved enough in your life. Maybe.
The moving didn't bother me, and my wife, she's become a trooper. We pick up and move tomorrow. I mean, she's a trooper. But we needed to get her stabilized as best we could. And it was not. It was. Yeah. I don't even have time to tell you what it was like.
No. Can't imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're out of the Army, CGSC. You've got this kind of academic career that follows forth. You're writing and researching and talking about this back half of the war. I'm personally intrigued. Right, what is your experience being a Vietnam veteran as an academic writing about the Vietnam War?
It has its challenges. I'll give you an example. I wrote a book about the Battle of An Long. You have to look very closely to determine that I was even there, because it's not. I don't do memoirs. That's not mine. Somebody with a more interesting life than me needs to write a memoir, not me. When I wrote that book, I refused to put anything in the book that I could not verify by another source. And there were a couple of stories that I, heard that I took for real that happened during the battle. But I found that memory, particularly, and I won't be ugly about this, but veteran memories are perishable. So I refused to put anything in there that I couldn't verify by another source. I'll give you an example. There was one instance, and I only heard about it because artillery was constant. For the first month, it was 24 hours a day. You couldn't even go outside to eat. So we didn't get around and talk a lot, but I heard that there were 3 Vietnamese women that were inside the town that were adjusting artillery on the town from Bin Side, that were basically North Vietnamese agents that were captured in the process of doing that. And supposedly they were tied up and put out in City Square, which was like ground zero for the artillery. And of course they died. I heard that, couldn't verify, didn't know, okay, could be one of those sort of urban myth kind of things. I was rummaging through some reports from one of the defense contractors, Rand. Rand had done some interviews of refugees that were streaming out of, when they could get out of An Long, then after the battle. And I found 3 accounts in there that recounted this particular incident. So I put it in them. Otherwise, I wasn't going to put it in there because I wasn't sure that I couldn't verify that it actually happened. Sure. So those are the kinds of things that I have to kind of deal with. And I avoid the whole I was there kind of stuff because I don't like to do that. I've had people ask me to do a memoir, and I'm never going to do it. Ever. But I spent 12 years on the faculty teaching national security policy, got my PhD en route, and then when I got it, I then transitioned to the history department. And I went to the West Point History Fellowship, the summer fellowship, to kind of change my mind from joint multinational to history. I was in the department less than a year, and there was a bunch of very strange machinations. The 06, the colonel, who was the new department director, got picked up to be an installation commander at Fort Riley, and they chose me to be the director. I hadn't been in the department a year yet. Never have quite figured out why or how that happened, but I was happy with it. Some of the other people weren't. They got over it. And I spent 12 years doing that. And then the last 2 years, I was the marshal chair without any adult supervision, which was a fantastic gig.
Sounds like a good one.
I taught my electives. I traveled a lot. I spoke a lot, did a lot of research. It was a good deal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I was going to retire 2 years earlier than I did.
Yeah.
And they asked me if I would stay and do that full time and still teach. And I said, sure. And it worked out well. And the moment my granddaughter graduated from high school, we pulled pitch, headed south. There it is in a nutshell.
There it is. Okay. You have this really interesting, obviously you have this interesting career in the Army, this kind of very closely related post-Army career, right? You are an academic, an expert, an observer of something you were a part of, right? You know, I have this question, right? Are you involved with veterans organizations? Do you remain in contact with anyone who you serve? You know, what is your post-Army connection to the Army that is not academic?
Mostly it's through a very small coterie of friends that I served with, most of them multiple times. One individual I served with, started out with an infantry officer basic and served with five times. Most of the other people that I remain, in contact with are people that I've from my career as an academic. I don't go to reunions because advisory teams, I've been to 2 advisory team reunions and they weren't my advisory team. They were the advisory team. See, I was from another regiment from another division that just happened to be in Anlock, which was controlled by an entire different division, the Fifth Army. I didn't know any of those guys when I went up there. Couldn't have picked them out of a lineup, didn't even know who they were. And I have since met a couple of times with them, but I'm always kind of the outsider guy. Interestingly enough, I spent more time there than most of those guys did because they pulled most of them out when it started. I belong to VFW, Vietnam Veterans of America, American Legion, which means I pay my dues. I don't go to meetings. Not my thing. I'm not into groups.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you here, right? Because I think I know you've had this very really fascinating, interesting life, but you have this perspective on it that is, I think, really important, right? And so as I want to like kind of close it out here a little bit, right? I've got some kind of like big picture questions I wanted to ask you, right? This one, I'll start with an easy one, I think.
Okay.
Why did you originally choose to join the
Army? It's what I knew. I mean, it's what I wanted to do. I always, even as a young kid, I guess I was. I have since found out that the glamour of combat ain't very glamorous. But as a young kid, reading comic books and movies and the popular culture, and I'm a child of World War II in Korea. That's what I grew up on. Courageous men doing courageous things in hard times, as trite as that sounds. And those the kinds of things I was interested in doing. And the fact that I've been around the military my entire life. My entire life. I'm 77 years old, and I've been around it since the day I was born. It's kind of like all I know. I mean, I've been in it one capacity or another for that entire time, with the exception of the last 5 years. And I still teach at CGSC in the spring.
I didn't know that.
I go for a week and do a week's worth of Vietnam lectures. And I also do one lecture, usually in Pearl Harbor for the Navy.
Hmm.
It's a tough gig, but somebody's got to do it.
Someone's got to do it. Yeah. Yeah. It's the trips you get to go on. I'm always in awe of. So, and this might be a weird question, but what was your favorite part of your Army career? If you could name one or think of one.
I think it was, I liked it all. I mean, I like the fact that in the back of your mind is that if it's not great, it'll change. If you're not working for a good person, eventually you'll work for somebody that is. Uh, it's kind of cyclical, and I've worked for some people that were fantastic humans, and I've worked for people that were less than fantastic. I'm being charitable in my old age, but I've met some fantastic people, uh, peers, people, enlisted. I mean, it's just the military is about people, and I've always been fascinated by what fascinated me about the military was combat. What made somebody who normally could have been a non-entity stand up and assault a machine gun? What makes them do that? What's the motivation? What are the dynamics of that? What causes them to do that? What are the ramifications of it? Um, so it's the human dynamics of warfare that have always interested. Used to tell my students I taught tactics twice. Used to think I was pretty good at it, but I would tell them, when you draw those big arrows on the map, a lot of shit going on inside those arrows. And that's the stuff that interests me, not the big arrows. And that's kind of what caused me to go in the military and kept me interested. As I said, when I started my PhD program with Ted Wilson, God rest his soul, one of the finest humans I ever knew in my life, um, and is the reason I have a PhD, because I probably would have quit like 8 times if it hadn't been for him. And he said, "What do you want to write about?" And I said, I don't know what I want to write." "Oh, what do you think about a lot?" And I said, "I still think a lot about Vietnam." And he said, "Well, it seems like that's what you ought to write about then." And so I have spent my adult life then trying to figure out what my minuscule participation and contribution and how that fits within the larger scheme of things. Still dealing with, still trying to figure it out.
Well, it's a big question. Um, so again, kind of closing this out, right? I think I know the answer to this. Would you serve if you could do it over again?
Absolutely, 100%.
Um, and I'm excited to hear your answer to this. What advice would you have for young people entering the military today?
Well, that's a hard one. I've been listening to Bill Maher. Perhaps this is the wrong time to ask me this question. Uh, I guess the thing that I would say, and without sounding overly dramatic here, is that this country exists because people have done things that had to be done, even when they didn't want to do them, and that there are things worth dying for. Yes, without sounding too melodramatic here. Um,
It's it's a question that leads to melodramatic answers, I think.
well, there are a lot of things wrong with this country, but I can't think of any other place that I'd rather be. I am concerned for the future of the republic. I'll be quite frank with you about that. There are many troubling things these days. Causes me to wonder what kind of country we're leaving for my grandkids and their grandkids. Hopefully, saner minds will prevail.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think that's why I wanted to ask this, right? Because the military is in such a different place, than obviously when you entered, when you left, where we were at when I was, of a certain age. But it's it's an interesting moment for young people entering the American military, and so I think it's I don't know. I think it's going to be very interesting to see where we head from this point.
Well, I'm a little concerned because I think the American education program does not spend enough time telling our young people how we got to where we are today, good, bad, and indifferent, good, bad, and ugly. And consequently, I wonder how an uninformed public goes forward, whether they're in uniform or not. Number one, I think we have to start paying our teachers more so that they can start doing, as good a job as most of them want to do. I don't even want to get started on the politics. It just makes me crazy.
I think that's a safe call.
And I'm an equal opportunity castigator because I don't like either one of the parties. I keep riding. I hope for someone, man, woman, whoever, come riding in on a white horse. Please, any day now. Come quickly.
I'm right there with you, I think. Okay. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you want to add here? Is there anything you'd like to add that I didn't cover?
No, I guess one of the most significant things I was able to be involved in was the Ken Burns thing. We haven't talked about that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry about that. Yeah. So tell me about that.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic as well.
So this is the 2017 Ken Burns, Lynn Novak documentary on the Vietnam War.
One of the best things I've ever been involved in. Did not agree with everything that was said or that was known. I started out, I was purely an advisor, along with Greg Daddis and Roger Spiller, a number of other folks. Joe Galloway. First time we met in his place in Manhattan, and we were sitting around the table, and we had seen the first cut by Jeff Ward of the script. And frankly, it was full of the usual early 80s trope, which I didn't care for. The Heart of Darkness bullshit. So we were introducing ourselves, and they got around to me. Greg introduced himself, got to me, and I said, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I'm not going to be part of this if this is what this program is going to be. And I said, what you have described in your script is not my experience. It may be the experience of some, but it's not the experience of all. And consequently, I'm not going to be part of this. He jumped up, ran around the table, says, grabbed me by the arm, says, you can't leave. And I said, why can't I leave? And he said, because you have to stay or your part of the story won't be told. And he said, as a matter of fact, I would like to interview you if you agree to it. And I said, well, depends on what you want to talk about. Anyway, to make a long story short, I stayed and I was interviewed and I was on camera. But over the process of almost 5 years, we had these meetings of the advice. There were about 20 of us. You'd know most of them. Ed Miller, Joe Galloway, Daddis. And we would have these, and we would go every word, every image, every foot of film, and it would be like what I would think is the highest level graduate seminar. And there'd be arguments. There were many times we did not agree, but it never got disagreeable. And so I think the product was pretty good, I think. But I have been castigated by my fellow veterans in many cases for even having anything to do with it. Because it's, in fact, I was upbraided in a public forum, or he attempted to, brother tried to upbraid me I had just, in fact, I hadn't got to Texas yet. I had retired and driven through Lubbock on the way to Georgetown. My family was still in Kansas. And they asked me to do the keynote address at night. So I got up and talked about, you answered hopefully the same questions you just asked me about how do you write and be a historian about the war you participated in. So I did my usual stick there. And then they had the question and answer. They stuck the microphones out, and Steve Turner was at the top of the list. And he goes up, and he's got a full head of steam on. And I just said, whatever you didn't like about Ken, and I know he'd been foaming at the mouth publicly ever since it'd come out. Came out fall of 2017, and this is April 2018. And I said, whatever you didn't like about it, it's absolutely my fault. I wrote it like that. And he just started sputtering. He did that. He had nothing else to say. But there are a lot of, I don't know. I don't want to. I don't want to disparage anybody and anybody's experience, but memory is perishable, and that's probably the nicest thing I probably should say. Sometimes folks remember things that didn't happen. And I've seen things said, for instance, at the center's conferences by veterans, that just are nonsensical. They didn't happen when they were espoused to have happened. They didn't happen in the way that they happened. They didn't happen in a way that was remembered. And I guess that's the difference between personal experience and then research, which I've had the benefit of doing.
Well, and I mean, that's why I think you were such an important part of that project, and why I think your joint experiences are they work so well together, because it is obviously a fairly difficult thing for us to reconcile as a people, and then that is even exponentially more difficult for the individuals that participated in your conflict. And so I think, I've always applauded you for the way you've handled yourself, and you've been steadfast in, this is a complicated thing, and one experience is not the other, and that has to be a difficult position for some people to end on, maybe.
Well, it's very difficult sometimes. It's all like I told my students. You talk to Vietnam veterans, you need to ask them 3 questions: when were you there? Where were you there? And what were you doing? This fellow that's a friend of mine, he's retired 3-star, as a matter of fact. We started out together in infantry officer basic. Some of us have done better than others, He and I were in Vietnam at the same time. We are actually on the same 1 to 50,000 map sheet, which is basically a map sheet, that's about 4 foot by 4 foot. So not a very large area of terrain. He was a company commander in 112 Cav, in one of the 4 battalions that was left in country, and I was advisor. And our experiences, we might as well have been on Mars and Venus together, because there is no correlation whatsoever, even though we were there same time, same terrain, different jobs. And that's sometimes hard to get people to understand, because there is no universal Vietnam experience. There's like I don't know, 2.5 million of them.
Yeah, which I think is such a beautiful way to put it, because I mean, that is the experience of I would imagine any conflict, war, combat experience, right? I mean, it's
sure.
Painting with a broad brush is problematic always.
Some of it is kind of, if it wasn't tragic, it would be comical. Yeah. There's the old saw among some people that, according to all the personal experiences, there must have been 2 million SF guys in Vietnam. And there weren't 2 million. You find very few guys who say, hey, I was just a damn truck driver. I was a cook.
Yeah.
And, we both know how many guys were carrying rifles, and it wasn't a whole hell of a lot compared to the larger scheme of things. But I've had people say, well, you're an advisor, so you didn't see any combat, right? No? Oh, well, a little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Anything else, Jim?
What else can I tell you? That's about my shtick as far as it goes.
Well, I truly appreciate you taking the time and sharing your story with me.
Well, I appreciate you listening. I'm sure that you've probably heard it before, one fashion or the other.
No, I learn something new every time, Jim. So I
Hmm.
truly appreciate it. And thank you for participating in the project.
Well, I think it's a great project. Let me know if you're still looking for other guys to talk to. I can put you on to.
Always.